Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery preparing to check in on a couple bins in which my so-called original red wiggler worms live. They live in these two black tubs. As you can see, they're labeled accordingly. Original red wigglers. There was a point in time where I lost almost all my red wigglers. I just managed to rescue a very small number of them, and then ever since then I've been nursing that small population back and always referring to them since then as my original red wigglers. That's kind of how they got their name. Here and there I've got other bins that I have red wigglers in. Those worms I've since sourced from my outdoor worm systems, my compost barrel, and my outdoor worm bag. But these are the only ones that I can really trace back to my original population of worms that I began with. So, in this particular incarnation, living in these two bins, they've been in these bins now for the past 104 days, so we sort of skipped over their 100 day in service milestone date, so yay, happy 100 days, belated. And not only have they gotten into 3 digits from an age perspective, breaching the 100 days, today they're going to feeding number 10, so they're getting into double digits in terms of how many times they've been fed. So when we checked in here 13 days ago, there had only been 9 days since the prior feeding. We found a bunch of leftovers, so this time I'm thinking since it was 13 days interval between feedings, maybe we won't see any leftovers. Well, even if we do, I'm going to feed them anyway. So I'm going to get a glove on, we're going to get those systems up on the bench, and we're going to get them fed. So let's get started. The stuff I'm feeding them with today is what you see here is the rinds of watermelon and some banana peels. So a nice sweet treat for these little guys. And I am curious to see if we're going to encounter leftovers. When we get done, I was going to provide the system with a nice top coating of leafy matter. So for that purpose, I've got my box of leaves here. The last time we came in here, there was a nice leafy top covering, but I didn't really take much care in preserving it. And then that stuff sort of just got blended in for the most part. A little bit of it remains out here on the surface, but for the most part, it's all been kind of blended in, so it'll be kind of nice when we're done here to provide them with a nice top coating of leafy matter. So we didn't deploy feeding zone indicators, but when we don't deploy feeding zone indicators, it's fair to assume that the foods were applied right down the middle of the bins. So why don't we just dive right into the middle of the bins to see what we see. A couple of the things that they were fed were things that I normally don't feed, and I think they were, gosh, I always forget. They went in here kind of large objects. Is it fennel, maybe? Or anise? I kind of expected to sense a little bit of a licorice scent when we got in here, but so far the only things I found were a piece of mango seed and the stem of a pumpkin. Both items that are likely to take quite some time, and I don't think that those were really what I was thinking of as far as leftovers go. There were other materials in here that were stuff that probably would have vanished already. So these are definitely chunks of what they were fed last time, I believe. I think this is a piece of lime, if I'm not mistaken. And I believe it is. It's got that nice citrusy smell. Let's make sure we don't leave any wormies stranded over there on the rim of the container where they could drop off and end up on the table. I don't know, maybe that fennel or whatever it was got eaten. I myself don't really like the scent of this stuff, and whenever there's foods that include that stuff, I generally steer clear of it because I'm not too fond of the scent, so most likely not going to enjoy placing it in my mouth. Who knows, maybe the stuff tastes delicious. I just don't tend to give things much of a chance if I'm not capable of getting over the repulsion that I sense of something that I don't like the smell of. I'm sure I'm not alone from that point of view. So it does seem like, other than those couple of slow composting items that we found in the beginning, pumpkin stem, mango seed, and I guess even a lime to some degree would probably be considered as a somewhat slow composting item. I don't think we're seeing a whole lot of anything else. I mean, Some of this green leafy matter is very difficult to identify. I'm not sure what that is, but it could be a partial leftover from the last feeding, and if it is, then it certainly isn't much. So it does seem like over the past 13 days, these wormies have done a nice job working down the stuff that they were given. The fact that they've got some leftovers is cool. Not going to dissuade me from giving them another feeding today. And, you know, if I had to bet a nickel, I would assume that the stuff that we're giving them today is not going to last. I don't think we'll find any leftovers of that. Even if we came back in a few days, the stuff would probably be, for the most part, gone. So, now that we're over in the second container, it is fair to expect that we're going to find similar things. So just like we saw here, a piece of chopped up mango seed, and the seed itself from the inside might have already been consumed by the worms. This is really just that outer tough husk of the mango seed. And we've actually found 3 pieces. In this case, I took the mango seed and I chopped it into multiple pieces, giving the worms direct access to the inside of it. Sometimes I just throw the thing in whole, and it takes weeks and weeks, sometimes months, for it to even get soft enough that I can crack it and open the shell so that they can get at the seed inside. So I figured just by cutting them that way, we probably help the breakdown process considerably. And not too surprising, here's a stem of a pumpkin, and somehow this worm has managed to find some sort of a little hole in there. Oh, no, it wasn't a hole, it was just a chunk of compost, vermicompost, that he was sort of hanging out in. And I wouldn't be too surprised if we encountered a chunk of lime, and if we were to experience a nice little refreshing citrusy smell. And that's what we have here. Lime, like I said earlier, I believe is one of those things that does take a little bit of time to get broken down, but as you can see, there's worms on it, so they're not put off by it. So there's nothing about it that's going to cause them to not want to start nibbling on it. It just probably resists decomposition and takes a little bit longer, but it'll go just like everything else. So we're now set, I believe, to come in with some bedding onto which we can place all that yummy food. I've got my container of prepared bedding over here on the shelf, so let's tap into that to provide a nice little foundation onto which today's feeding can get placed. Let's make sure we don't have any wormies on our hands, otherwise my supply of bedding will be occupied by a single worm living the good life in a huge container of fresh bedding. Although this bedding is not very damp, so they probably feel a little bit uncomfortable in this stuff. But you know, once all those watermelon rinds begin kicking off their moisture content, this bedding material is going to become nice and damp, and then the worms are going to feel quite comfortable diving down into this stuff. And I would guess that as far as leftovers go next time, if we do find anything, chances are one of the things we're almost certain to find leftovers of is the stem of the banana peel, and some of the peel itself, I would assume, because that does take them a little while sometimes to break down. But this stuff here, you know, if you ask me, this stuff is not going to last. This has got to be among their favorites. Nice, easy to eat, juicy, damp foods. Sweet watermelon. Look at this big piece here. Let's make sure we divvy everything out evenly to these two systems. And if you ask me, we did a pretty good job splitting up the share of delicious fruity materials to both bins evenly. Even though I don't think that they're going to need much grit to do away with a delicious meal like this, I'm giving them some anyway. And you know, this being the 10th feeding, I wouldn't be too surprised if over a number of other past feedings we've probably already given them grit once or twice at least. So it's not always that important. In the beginning, I try to be careful not to skip the grit, since new systems are usually a little bit deficient in grit in general, but systems like this that have already been fed 10 times now, chances are that they've got a pretty good supply of grit. So, you know what? I figured, before we cover up, why don't we just give them a little bit more bedding? I'm feeling a little bit generous because I just prepared a bunch of fresh shredded paper cardboard, so when this here runs out I can certainly make more because I've got a bucket of the stuff sitting over there on the side, dry, ready to go. So I figured let's give them a really nice feeding zone full of delicious foods, plenty of bedding, and even some grit. So now I think we can use some of these materials that are located out on the edge of the system, bring some of it inboard with which we can cover up the feeding zone. And out here it almost seems like there's nothing other than worm castings, and they're quite damp for that matter. And I assume that the fact that they're as damp as they are, that's probably got a good bit to do with why it's so heavily populated. There's just a ton of worms hanging out there. So even though you would think that the feeding zone is where you're most likely to find the majority of the worms in your worm bins, it just seems to me like they're quite content to be almost anywhere within the system. So it is kind of nice to be able to kind of look almost anywhere in your system and see a fairly large number of worms cruising around, feeling quite at home. And it's pretty surprising, considering that we're covering up only with newspaper here, how nice and damp things are. I think that's going to continue through the summer, because my basement here does not have any form of climate control. Nothing that's going to dry the air out the way it does in the summertime, the winter time when the heat's constantly running upstairs. It just tends to dry the air out in the house throughout the entire house, But in the summertime, I only run window-mounted air conditioners once in a while. And even then, they just sort of cool the air down a little bit. But for the most part, the air in the house is pretty humid. And that's because over here in central Jersey, this is a pretty humid time of year. So I do find that when the air is humid in the house, the worm bins tend to hang on to their moisture really easily, and even stuff left uncovered manages to not dry out, just because the air is not going to really suck any moisture out of stuff and really stifles evaporation. So let's not forget, we wanted to provide each system with a nice top coating of leafy matter. So before we bring the newspaper covers back on, let's follow through on that as well. So I'm thinking this might also be a good opportunity for me to use some of this leafy matter to scrub some of the worm castings off my gloves. Leave all that nice stuff down here in the worm bin rather than taking it with me to the sink and rinsing it away. And we are definitely being generous here with the leafy matter as far as top dressing. This stuff is going to become a really nice bedding. Later on when we come back in here for the next feeding, a lot of times I'll just use this stuff, collect it up, and then when it comes time to set up their feeding zone, rather than bringing in the shredded paper cardboard mix, I just repurpose what had been the top dressing of leaves as the foundational bedding to drop in beneath the foods that they're getting. So by then this stuff will go from being kind of dry and sterile to being fully inundated with microbes and bacteria and fungi. It would make for a really fantastic foundational bedding onto which to place the next feeding. So that's pretty likely what we'll do next time we get back in here. And who knows when that'll be. With this feeding that we just gave them, they could be ready for more within a couple days, if you ask me. Alright everyone, that's it for the video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.